Well, my lungs aren't the greatest today, but this might be a long recording, you never know. I've made it before in several bits and pieces. One of the things my brother and I do have in common is we both wonder why my mother, who was a Christian, nominally, my brother thinks devout. I never saw any evidence that she was a devout Christian. She didn't own a Bible or a hymn book or a crucifix or a cross or whatever. But she certainly did call herself Church of England, and she certainly had been raised in convent boarding schools and what have you, and with spinster aunts, maiden aunts, who were devout Christians. So my brother and I both wonder why on earth she ran off with a man who was married and took up residence with him. It seems totally out of character. And she seemed to have a very clean, that isn't the right word, a very innocent background prior to that. They didn't exactly do one of their disappearing tricks between January and July 1946, i.e. after World War II was over. They were both in Malaya in the January. At some point, they went to Ceylon together, and the only time I can personally fit that into their hectic travel schedules is in those 6 months, January to July of 1946. Now, my mother, I discovered just by looking at a book on my bookshelf, returned on the troop ship MS Sieberjack, which is a Dutch troop ship. I have no idea how my father returned or when. And there's nothing to say that my mother did not get off that troop ship at Colombo. And perhaps they both did. I don't know. This is speculation. As to running off with a married man, still puzzled. Especially when I consider that I'm not even sure she knew he was married until 1971. I do have reasons for that, for thinking that. So she used to talk about a trunk of souvenirs that my father had, of hers, that my father had somehow lost. She was very bitter about it. And I actually do wonder if the trunk contained, among other things, perhaps a marriage certificate that took place in Ceylon. I do wonder that. It would have had to be registered in England, but of course if the trunk was lost, it couldn't be. It's just a thought. Then they turn up. They had 3 identical photos. In fact, it looks as if there were originally 4. A sort of postcard cut into quarters. This photograph is taken in it is in Piccadilly Circus as far as I can see. My father had a copy which he dated July 1946. I beg your pardon, he dated it 11th July 1946. My mother's was simply dated July 1946. Now, I do wonder why the hell they kept this photograph at all, and yet they kept it until the end of their lives. This is it. It's a copy of it, and unfortunately my father's face is a bit damaged on this one. Now, always difficult to know what's showing up. I will leave it for a few seconds, because what I notice, personally, is that they both look as miserable as sin. My mother is staring at the ground, won't look up at the photographer. My father's frowning. They're actually not holding hands. My father's hand is sort of suspended over my mother's, but she is not returning that. She's not holding his hand. And she's wearing this little bitty hat on top of her head, which she kept in a hat box for the rest of her life. She never wore it again. But in my childish curiosity, I found it wrapped up in tissue paper in this hat box. That hat, which I think it looks as if this was the only occasion she ever actually wore it. And she's got something held in her hand, something scrolled up in her hand. And I'd be really interested personally to know what that was. I got the right pile here. I concluded that my mother would probably only have stayed with my father after she discovered she couldn't marry him. Some marriage abroad had not taken, because it couldn't be registered. Why she stayed with him after that is a mystery, unless I consider, and I have in detail, this was way back at the beginning, the possibility that she was pregnant. So I began looking for, her maiden name was Noyes. I began looking for births, Noyes, so, where the mother's maiden name is the same as the baby's name, i.e. she's not married, in all probability. A Noyes birth in the summer of 1946. And it did seem, I struck gold straight away. Of course, I didn't know it straight away. And Amelia Noyes gave birth in the summer of 1946. If I believe the birth certificate, and I am unsure about two of these certificates because of the registrars. One of the registrars were a brother and sister team, Thomas and Doris Standing. Now, the surname Standing crops up over and over and over again, mostly, I have to say, in my father's life. It's quite an unusual one. Amelia Noyes gave birth to a boy named Albert on the 2nd of June 1946, bearing in mind that that photograph is dated the 11th of July 1946. So I'll come to my explanation of that. Just a quick look at the certificate. The baby was born in the English equivalent of the Magdalen Laundry. It was the Sisters of Mercy in Windsor, and Amelia's occupation is given as laundry hand. This is Albert. I never can tell how visible it all is, so I'll move it around a bit. If I believe the date and everything else, this woman Amelia Noyes had a baby on the 2nd of June 1946. She did not, however, register him until the 18th of July 1946. I could 7 days after the photograph in Piccadilly. Let me see, that's 48 days, isn't it, between the birth and the registration. Then I did have a nice little timeline, and my parents' photograph is right in the middle of that timeline. Albert had the misfortune to die. He died on the 13th of August, 1946. Let's make sure, yes. And gastroenteritis, which was common in those laundries. Babies died of gastroenteritis an awful lot in those laundries. Now, the birth was registered by Doris Standing and the death by Thomas Standing. Who finally got round to registering it. Sorry, I beg your pardon. The hospital occupier registered the death on the 2nd of September, which is what, 20 days after death. Neither parent registered the death. The hospital occupier did. Now, you wouldn't think anyone in their right mind would go through that again. And I'm not even sure why I looked for another Noyes birth in the summer of 1947, because that was when my brother was born. So I don't know why I was still looking for a Noyes birth, because by that time my mother had taken the name Oakley by deed poll. But I did look, and although the birth that came up was in Newbury, whereas the first was in Windsor, I again got the birth certificate. Lo and behold, it's Amelia Noyes again. Giving birth from the same address in Windsor, i.e. the laundry there, the Sisters of Mercy place for unmarried mothers. From the same address, but somebody drove her 40 miles to Newbury for the birth. This time the boy is called Robert Edward. Robert Edward was born on the 16th of July, the day before my brother. My mother used to say that my brother was born at midnight. This actually happened with my older daughter. She has 2 birthdays, the 13th and 14th of July. She was a breech birth. Her body was out on the 13th. Her head came out at 5 past midnight on the 14th. We always celebrated her birthday on the 14th. But my medical records say she was born on the 13th. So, whereas in the beginning I thought, no, my mother wouldn't have pinched somebody else's identity to give birth, I started to get a lot less sure about that. You have to take into account the time and the kind of family she came from, the era, and I'm not excusing it. I think it entirely possible that she did borrow the identity of Amelia Noyes, not least because, as it turned out, Amelia Noyes was related to her. She was either an illegitimate cousin or an illegitimate half-sister. That would take quite a bit of explaining. And it has to do with my grandmother's death entry having been registered twice in 2 different places. It would take a bit of explaining there. Her father, my great-grandfather, re-registered her death roughly 3 months after it happened, and he registered the original entry was in Epsom. The entry he gave was in Brighton, which would have put her very close to Hearth, home and children. Epsom didn't. Epsom put her elsewhere, and you have to wonder why a mother of 2 children, a widow, died so far from her home, and why her father altered the entry. I concluded that perhaps there had been a love interest, and that she had died of childbirth. This is not just fantasy and speculation. I am going by some things that one of her sisters said. Anyway, Amelia Noyes, however she was related to my mother, was related to my mother. My mother had a cousin called Ruby, who lived in Hartley Whitney, who didn't die until 2000 and something, and I never met in my entire life. She avoided this cousin like the plague, this cousin being a legitimate one. But she lived very close to Amelia Noyes, and in fact, the places kept tallying. The places where Amelia was and the places where Ruby were kept sort of crisscrossing. I eventually concluded that my mother had, in fact, borrowed Amelia's identity. Well, Amelia came from an incredibly complex family. She had a sister younger than the baby Albert who died. Her mother gave birth to a baby 3 days after Amelia's baby died. And it's considerably more complicated than that. I know, sugar, will this upload to YouTube because it's now 16 minutes and 30 something. I've got to stop, and I was going to make a long one.